You are now watching The Lone Blown. Blown! Yo, what's poppin' YouTube? Welcome back to The Lone Blown. I'm The Lone Blown, and today I'm actually going to be sharing a special video that I think will be especially helpful while you're playing through your Players' Cup 3 keys. So if you are eligible to be playing through the Players' Cup, this video features my top 4 best decks for this event. So whether you're grinding out your 50 keys, or maybe you're looking for some inspiration or just some top level deck lists, I know I'm going to be featuring my top 10 deck lists in standard this week, or maybe next week, depending on how my schedule plays out. But I did want to give you a little bit of help for the Players' Cup early, and I think that this is going to be very helpful as you play through your Players' Cup, because these 4 seem to kind of stick above outside of the pack. They're the best decks right now for the Players' Cup 3. All lists are below if you do want to copy and paste those into PTCGO. If you're missing any of the cards for these decks, go to PTCGOstore.com, plug in code ZLASAGE5 to save 5% on your next order of codes, whether or not there's for these decks or something else that you're looking for your collection, whatever it is. But for me, I was actually able to win the Players' Cup 2, if you didn't know. Not that I'm trying to like shout that out wherever I can, but for anyone who's like looking for kind of validity towards me as a player, I do have multiple accomplishments. I did win the Players' Cup 2, so these are the decks that are helping me through the Players' Cup 3. Currently, I've used about 15 keys, and I'm at 42 rep, so that puts me on track for hitting like 130 plus area, and I'm trying to do a little bit better than that, just because like I've had a little bit of few strings of poor luck, but that's going to happen in this format. So let's look at these decks. Not going to be in any particular order or anything like that, depends on your flavor. I'm also going to put links up at the top, so you can look at the full deck list profile, what is going on about these decks. So hopefully this video is super informative. If you like this video, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. All right, let's jump into our first deck. So coming in hot after my hot takes video on this deck, I do think it is one of the best decks, and it's one of the top performing decks in the format right now. So I'd be an absolute fool if I didn't include Lucario, Melmetal, Zacian in our top 4 decks for the Players' Cup 3 qualifiers. This deck, for me, I think it's very matchup based. If you're hitting those Vmax decks, or if you're hitting things that are like weak to metal, this deck is very good. The thing that really scares me, there's a lot of very successful fire type decks that are being played around. Centiskorch being the #1 most played deck, obviously one of the best decks that we have in the game, but there's also Blacephalon, there's also the side variant of Chrycephalon, there's also Tempozard, Fire Toolbox, all these kinds of decks. And I mean, people always come up with random fire decks. I know that I was playing my Centiskorch Reshiram Charizard deck last week. So there's a lot of like these toolboxy fire decks that I think just have a favorable matchup against Lucario and Melmetal. Now, that's not to say you can't win. There's Coding Metal Energy. And even the video that I played Lucario and Melmetal, I was able to beat one of these Blacephalon decks, even though that there is that weakness. So maybe this deck is a little bit more prevailing than I think. The only issue, like, again, the issue, and I don't want to be like, hey, I have all these issues, you should play this deck. My biggest issue with this deck is that it seems to only prey against weaker players. Top players tend to have a strategy against it, as long as their deck allows them to. Some decks, like Colossal, do just fold to this deck instantly. But decks like Eternatus Vmax can comfortably play a game against this with their techs like Spiritomb and Hoopa and Yveltal and Crobat. So that's kind of what worries me a little bit. However, I do think that this deck is quite strong. It does have a slightly favorable Pikachu matchup. It does have a slightly favorable Eternatus matchup. It does do okay against ADP. It's about 50-50. Like, there's a lot of good things going for this deck. Sometimes you're going to get stuck just using Intrepid Sword, but this deck, based off of Zach Cooper's list, the list that he sent me, shout out to them, it does have all those extra supporter cards at the 4/4/4 count, and the Mallow Lanas, and the Pokegears, so this deck should be fairly consistent. If you're a fan of Lucario Melmetal Zacian, and you've been doing okay already, feel free to try out this list, or maybe take some of the kind of text that we have in this list and experiment with it a little bit. I think that this deck's fine. I wish that I played it a little bit more. Like in my case, like I think that it's fine. I don't necessarily think that I'm winning as much as other decks, but I don't necessarily feel like this deck is doing bad for me. So I might experiment a few more keys. I know that I've had some takes on Twitter where I think this deck is awful and stuff like that. It's really just more of me being frustrated with this format than anything else. I think sometimes you just gotta take a few days off Pokemon, clear your mind out, and then jump back, especially when you have 50 keys. It's playing Pokemon in short bursts and preparing for a marathon than just running through your tickets. So this deck's cool. I don't hate it. Give it a try. So I've been the biggest advocate of Pikarom ever since I won the Players Cup 2 with this deck. And I mean, this list is largely, most Pikarom lists are largely based on my very successful list that I tested with my testing group, and that we were kind of able to take all the way. I mean, we played it for a few tournaments before the Players Cup. I was the only one from my group who advanced on as far as I did in the Players Cup. So I really took a lot of our findings that we were like holding back in case one of us were able to do so well in the Players Cup, and then really push it as far as we possibly could. So Mewtwo Mew in this deck kind of brought it as much, but the biggest innovation lately is the double team Yell Grunts. Now, I've seen a few other players playing this, but this is really just because Eternatus Vmax is such an absolute hot deck right now. Eternatus Vmax largely being the most played deck, or the most successful deck in our current standard formats, and it's just because, like, I feel the lists have gotten a little bit better, the lists have adapted to the metagame very well. Team Yell Grunt allows you to turn that back into a very winnable matchup, being able to lift away their energies, because they're just going attach. Sure, they could go Power Accelerator, but you also have Crushing Hammers. So between two Team Yell Grunts and an Eldegoss, you could easily just kind of bop off your opponent's energy while going for like Tandem Shock, kind of throwing a bunch of like hurdles for them to jump over. Now, if they're unable to jump over those hurdles, you're going to win the game. If they are, it's actually a very close game. But you can always just knock out one of their Eternatus Vmax. That's another way to get energies off their side of the field. So this can be very helpful. So if I was playing in any deck or any kind of tournament and I was looking for a Pikarom deck, this would be the Pikarom go-to list that I'd be playing. I think Pikarom has a wide variety of matchups that are fair. I don't necessarily think it has a lot of great matchups in format right now. It does do okay against Centiskorch, but it doesn't necessarily always win against everything. So if you're looking for kind of like a middle of the field deck that you can feel like you're in most games, or that you feel like you have opportunities to play in most games, Pikarom's really where it's going to be at. Other decks don't necessarily feel like that. Like when you're playing Eternatus against Lucario and Melmetal, you feel like you're unfavored. When you're playing Pikarom, even though it's an unfavorable matchup, you're like, well, I have a lot of options. Let's see how it goes. Most matchups feel a lot closer to a 50-50, and the skillfulness of a Pikarom player can often downplay how much a matchup is poor or not in your favor. So totally give this deck a try out. Fair matchups across the board. I think it's not as highly placed as it used to be as the metagame's evolved, but I think this deck is extremely well positioned, and it's one of the best decks that you could be playing for your Players Cup 3 keys. Centiskorch Vmax is a deck that a lot of players kind of dismissed. I know that this is one of the decks that I took to liking immediately on my Players Cup 2. I played it for my North American qualifiers, going a smooth 7-0 with a Pokegear version of the deck. Since then, Cashman and Thomas Brophy kind of broke this deck, and this list is heavily based off their version, Ian Robb's winning list. They're all going to be off by just a couple cards because they've kind of found an ideal list for the Scoop Up Net Jirachi version of Centiskorch. This deck kind of boasts strong matchups across the board. The only thing that it has against it is that it's a little bit inconsistent with Welder in general. I like playing this deck a lot in best of 3 tournaments. If there was a best of 3 tournament in our standard format tomorrow, this is probably going to be my go-to list, my go-to choice. However, with the events being best of 1, it's sometimes difficult to get the consistency that you need in order to kind of prevail over your opponents. Now, when the deck works, it works, and you're often just like absolutely crushing your opponent. When it doesn't work, there's still opportunities for you to play, but it feels very blah all the time. The one thing that I don't like about this deck is a lot of the time it feels flat. Like I'm just like, cool, I have nothing in my hand, but I'm going to swing you for a knockout. Maybe I'll get something out of my prize cards. It's a whole bunch of what ifs. And maybe that's just the deck's like inherent power over creeping the consistency needed to see success with this deck. Or at the same time, maybe it's just not as good as other decks. I'm not sure. But for me, this deck has given me some of my most success at the Players Cup 3 so far. It gave me success at the Players Cup 2, and quite often it's just not respected. This deck has favorable matchups against ADP, favorable matchups against LucMetal, and then it can do well against Eternatus, it can do well against Pikarom, it can do well against a lot of these other top decks in format. So do keep that in mind, that this deck does have a very strong matchup spread. I think it's basically like, this is inconsistent Eternatus, and that's the best way that I'd say it. Eternatus is a little bit more consistent than this deck, but this deck has a slightly better matchup spread. So it depends on what you're valuing, consistency, or are you valuing the matchup spread. I think that this deck's great, especially with 50 keys. Sure, you're going to bound to fall into some bouts of bad luck. Maybe you just naturally fall into that anyways. That's what makes me think that Centiskorch over time will often prevail and win a lot of games for you. If the metagame drastically switches, do not play this if there's a bunch of water decks, like Inteleon or Lapras, things like that. But if the metagame stays relatively the same, even after Hidden Fates or Shiny Fates is completely released, I think that this deck is probably just going to be very good and is arguably going to be one of the top picks to play for the Players' Cup 3 qualifiers, depending on whatever region you are in. So do keep... So here we go. This is my current love in the formats. If there's any deck that you're going to see me playing at a tournament on a day-by-day basis, it's probably going to be this Eternatus Vmax deck that myself, Andrew Pokahawkeye, and Gabriel Smart kind of worked on kind of a week or two ago, depending on when you're watching this video. This deck has seen a large amount of success since we kind of created this version of the deck, but the biggest success came from my girlfriend, Michelle Babin, who was able to win the Chill Series very recently with over 200 players. So she was able to come first place with a very similar list to this, and I'm just changing one or two cards depending on my Yveltal count, my Hoop account, Zigzagoon, Spiritomb. I talked about this in a recent Eternatus video, which again, you could click at the top. I'm going to tag it properly with the YouTube cards. This deck's just extremely powerful and extremely fast. Most matchups are going to come down to, hey, we just got nothing. You're able to overrun them with Eternatus Vmax, or maybe your opponent puts up a little bit of a fight, but it's hard to kind of deal with 270 damage as early as turn 2, and quite often it's always turn 2. Sure, this deck can fall into a little bit of inconsistency, but 4 copies of Crobat, 4 copies of Quick Ball, 4 copies of Great Ball, 2 Comms. There's just so much support going on in this deck. Quite often you're like, how am I not drawing properly with this deck? Now, one thing that you could do is maybe cut the dangerous drills if they're not working for you. I think they're really good against ADP, and just sometimes they're great against random decks. If your opponent plays special energies, you could just punish them for just making an incorrect choice, especially in Eternatus Mirror. Crushing Hammers is the same thing. If there's not a lot of Eternatus Vmax in your metagame, you probably don't need to worry about Crushing Hammers. They're really good against ADP, which is already a favorable matchup, but they're also very good against Eternatus Mirror. So if you're playing Eternatus with Hammers and your opponent's playing Eternatus without Hammers, you're quite often going to win the game like 70% of the time. So the Crushing Hammers are kind of here to stay. It sucks that they're kind of a necessary evil in our format right now, but it does make this deck very good, very powerful, and it does punish your opponent and can put them in some very awkward positions. So I do really like how this deck plays out. Seems like it's going to be an awesome play going forward. I know that I've won like 4 Players Cup tournaments already with this deck, and as much as some matchups scare me, this deck does have a strong matchup pool. It's very consistent, and I think it's going to win me the majority of my rep at the Players Cup. So we'll see how it goes. I might do a recap video maybe in a couple weeks as I continue on in play, or as I finish off my keys, kind of going over some data that might be able to help you if you're still playing at your keys. But I think this is absolutely the best deck that you could be playing for your Players Cup keys right now. I think it has a large variety of strong matchups, and I mean, there's not enough good things that I could be saying about this deck. Let me know what you think about the decks below in the comment, but I mean, I think this is the one right now. So I know we're on a short video today, just going over some decks that I think would be helpful for you at the Players Cup 3, but these are my top 4 decks right now, and these are the decks that I've been kind of running through. My rule of thumb is, whenever I'm in on a losing streak, I usually stop and take a day or 2 off of Pokemon. Obviously, if times of the essence, don't necessarily worry about that, but I just try to put myself in a good mental state whenever I'm playing at the Players Cup. Whenever I win a deck with a tournament, I usually wait a few minutes and then play the same deck again, because I've already seen success. There's no reason to try or to fix something that's not broken. If I lose to one of these meta decks in a tournament, I wait about a few minutes and then I jump in again with the deck that I lost to, because that seems like it's generally doing well against the metagame that's forming, because it's snapshots of a metagame. I've played against a lot of weird stuff, like a Charizard Braixen deck. I played against some Credilli Omastar decks. Sometimes you gotta think on your feet. That's why I like playing decks like Eternatus, because they have such a strong control over the metagame. Same thing with Centiskorch. Like, you're just not gonna sit there against a Decigoons and be like, cool, I lose. Right, and that happens with Pikarom quite often. That's going to happen against LucMetal's going to sit there and be like, cool, I hit a fire deck. I probably just lose. No matter how strong you are at some of these decks, do realize that the game is a little bit luck-based at times. Don't be too hard on yourself, and just continue to make it through those keys the best that you possibly can. No one's going to blame you for not getting as much rep. However, you can put a little bit more control in your hand by putting yourself in a great mental space, thinking about the proper metagame around here, and then taking down as much data as possible after each cup. I mean, I think it's worthwhile to be like the decks that you played against, so you have a decent surrounding metagame. It's better to play at certain times, maybe. Maybe there's a time where a lot of top players or more metagame decks are being played. Maybe you want to hit more metagame decks. Maybe you want to play at weirder hours in different time zones that will allow you to play against more different types of decks or players from a different region. There's a lot of things that are going on with the Players' Cup that you could do to put a little bit more success back into it. So, I mean, think outside the box. But if you're looking for any more information on these decks, again, I did card it all at the top. For each one of these decks, so you could check out the YouTube video that correlates to each deck. You could also kind of just subscribe to the channel for more good information. That's all I could say. I'm just kidding, not really, but yeah, I'm gonna go create some more content. I don't really know how to end off these videos sometimes. I just ramble on forever, but I hope you all enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. Have yourself a wonderful day, and peace out. Really hope that you enjoyed watching that video. I totally enjoyed making it. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like the video, share the video with everyone that you know, and subscribe to the channel as well. Totally appreciate all the support. We got a lot of cool things happening on the channel, so stay tuned for more. Be sure to check out the social links in the description. Thanks, and have yourself a great one.